To our program. I have the pleasure this evening of introducing tonight's guest lecturer. David McCullough is a renowned award-winning author and historian who can be seen frequently and heard on television and radio. His many achievements are listed in the booklet, the program that you were given, so I'll keep my introduction brief. In his writings, McCullough provides us with powerful images of our nation's heritage. We are honored to have one of our Commonwealth's greatest historians share his thoughts and insights on the value of history with us here this evening in Pennsylvania. Mr. McCullough, who now lives in Maine, spent his early years of his life in Pittsburgh and twice received the National Book Award and was twice the winner of the Pulitzer Prize. He was called a master of the art of narrative history. His books have been praised for their exceptional narrative sweep, their scholarship, and their insight into American life, and for their literary distinction. John Adams, his most recent work, hit the New York Times bestseller list at #1 and has remained on that list for more than a year. In addition to John Adams, his books include The Johnstown Flood, The Great Bridge, The Path Between Seas, Mornings on Horseback, Brave Companions, and Truman. As may be said of few other writers, none of his books has ever been out of print. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm welcome home to the 2004 Speaker's Millennium Lecturer, David McCullough.
Speaker Purcell, ladies and gentlemen, to be honored this way in this glorious refurbished capital of my home state, to be invited to speak in this stupendous space of the Hall of the House, to all of you, is one of the proudest, happiest, most thrilling moments for me ever. I am very moved, deeply moved, and I regret only that my editor-in-chief was not able to be here tonight. My wife, Rosalie, who is mission control for our very large family, which includes, among others, 17 grandchildren. And she's Secretary of the Treasury and Chairman of the Ethics Committee, and my lucky star. I wouldn't have had anything like the writing life or the life I've had it not been for her. And I thought it was so appropriate when John Adams received the Pulitzer Prize on April 8th, which is her birthday. It's interesting how you hear that you've won the Pulitzer Prize. It's not like those commercials for Publishers Clearinghouse. What happens is the phone rings and you answer it, and it's a reporter saying, "Are you aware that you've just won the Pulitzer Prize?" And of course you're not aware at all. The reporter was a man from the AP named Hillel Atali, and very quickly after that other calls followed from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette and from David Mehegan of the Boston Globe and the USA Today and National Public Radio, and it went on and on and on. And because our two daughters with their children were there for their mother's birthday, we were having a family celebration anyway. And about 8:15, we sat down to a nice, quiet family dinner. The phones had stopped ringing. And we were just getting started, and the phone rang again. And Rosalie got up to answer it, and we heard her say, "Yes, that's right." "Well, I don't know, let me see." And she covered up the phone with her hand, and she said, "It's Christine Maxwell from the Christian Science Monitor. Would you like to talk with her?" And I said, "Well, all right." So I got up and I went into the living room and picked up the other phone, and she said, "Mr. McCullough?" I said, "Yes." She said, "This is Christine Maxwell from the Christian Science Monitor," and I said, "Yes." And she said, "Are you aware of our special 23-week trial subscription then?" I had the very good fortune of growing up in this state, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I know for certain that a large part of what I have found absorbing and exciting and what I wanted to devote my working life to came from my boyhood in that city during the Second World War and through the very fortunate break of going to a great public school system and to an excellent private secondary school, Shadyside Academy, and from the wonderful complex of the Carnegie Library, the Carnegie Museums, the Carnegie Music Hall, the Carnegie Gallery. Very like this extraordinary building, which has the three branches of government under one roof in one building, the Carnegie Library system in Pittsburgh has the library, the music hall, the art gallery, and the Natural History Museum all under one roof. And I think what happens to a youngster under those conditions is you get the idea that these aren't separate interests. It's all interesting, and that you can go from one to another readily as one should, either in a building or in one's outlook on life. Children love to learn. I think that's one of the truths we too often forget, and particularly children at the grade school level. And to go to the Carnegie Library, to the Carnegie Museum in public grade school was, for us, a thrill. And to have the marvelous teachers we had. And to be living in a city that throbbed with power and which we knew because we heard it being said at the dinner table at night, and we heard it from our teachers in school, that Pittsburgh was playing a great part in history. The sky was red at night. It pulsed red with the mills, the blast furnaces going off. And we were told, we knew what that was for, and we were in a great world struggle, and we were playing our part in our way in Pittsburgh. My family sat down to dinner every night at 6:30. Those were the days when you had dinner together and talked about what happened during the day or what was happening in the world. And of course, a lot of it went right over my head, but a lot of it didn't. And the political discussions were fascinating. My grandmother thought that Franklin Roosevelt was the greatest human being that had ever lived, except for Jesus Christ. My father thought that Franklin Roosevelt was the undoing of the whole United States government. And their discussions on this topic at the dinner table were memorable, particularly since both were extremely hard of hearing. The decibel level was memorable and lively and interesting, never dull. We were allowed to go off on our own, too. Take the streetcar down to the library. Take out your first book. I remember what it was. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, Maggie Smith. Went down to East Liberty one time on the streetcar and bought my first book with my own money. I not only remember what it was, I still have it. A little modern library edition of Richard Henry Dana's 2 Years Before the Mast. And I picked that book up, and I read the first page, and it was all about going to sea. And here I was in Pittsburgh, never having seen the ocean or heard a seagull or smelled the odor of the surf and the sea in my life, and it all just seemed so entrancing, and I knew I had to have that book. It probably cost 25 cents then, something like that. And the encouragement at home was important. We depend on our teachers, but I must say we must take our parts as parents and grandparents, too, in bringing history to our children, bringing the love of learning and reading to our children and grandchildren. We can't just leave it all to the teachers. We shouldn't do that. And we had in our house books of a kind that I still love and still pick up and look at. All those wonderful books in the Scribner series, illustrated by the great Pennsylvania artist N.C. Wyeth, The Last of the Mohicans and Drums. And I would, in those days, all children were often ill for weeks at a time with diseases of mumps, measles, chickenpox, and you had to stay in bed, and there wasn't any television, so you lie there staring at those wonderful illustrations and putting yourself into them, using your imagination to put yourself into those pictures. I think, too, that it was very important to me and to others in my time that two prominent figures of that era came from Western Pennsylvania. George C. Marshall, General Marshall. We were so proud that this great, great man, truly one of the greatest Americans ever, came from Uniontown, Pennsylvania. And the other was Jimmy Stewart, who, of course, personified in so many of his movies the role of the good citizen, the role of the honest, hardworking, conscientious, admirable American. And there he was from State College, from Indiana, Pennsylvania. And I remember making a pilgrimage to see the house where he grew up. And I wanted to be like him. I wanted to be like George Marshall. And people, and particularly young people, I think, need that kind of inspiration. The fact that this state has played such a pivotal role in our story as a nation is part of what I want to talk about tonight. Tip O'Neill famously said that all politics is local. Well, you could make the same statement about history, that all history is local. But the local history of Pennsylvania is our national story. And it's a treasure that we are responsible for. We are responsible to preserve and save and respect those aspects of the history of our country and of this state that are all around us, such as this building. But we're also, it seems to me, responsible for teaching it, conveying it to the next generation, and encouraging people to read history, know history, not just because it makes us a better citizen, but for the pleasure of it, for the enlargement of the experience of being alive, the extension of the experience of being alive through history, just as we extend that experience through art, music, poetry, or the theater. Now, the most famous painting in America, by an American, by far, hangs in the rotunda of the National Capitol. It's the painting by John Trumbull of July 4th, 1776. And it depicts a room in what was, prior to that time, only a year or two before, the capital of Pennsylvania. It is a Pennsylvania setting. And it's seen every year by somewhere between 3 to 5 million people who pass through the rotunda in Washington. Now, to give you some idea of that, 2 million people visit Independence Hall each year. 1.5 million visit the Gettysburg battlefield. A little over 1 million visit Valley Forge, and on and on. Somewhere between 3 and 5 million people see that painting. And it's been hanging there since 1826, the year that Jefferson and Adams died on the 4th of July, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. We all know the painting, Jefferson, Franklin, and Adams standing in the foreground. And almost everything about it is inaccurate. Almost everything. The room didn't look like that. The doors are in the wrong place. The draperies at the windows are not the kind that were hanging. That embellishment of military flags and trophies hanging at the center of the painting on the back wall, that's an invention, that's artistic license on the part of John Trumbull. No such thing was hanging there. The furniture's wrong. The chairs weren't that at all. They were plain Windsor chairs. But one thing about the painting is very accurate, and that's why it's so important, and that's why it should have the honored place in our capital in Washington, and that is the faces. Those are the representations of specific individuals, 47 different men. 36 of them were drawn or painted from life. Trumbull wanted them to come through to us as specific people, because the Declaration of Independence wasn't handed down from a king or a czar or a pope or a sultan. It was the decision, the brave decision, of a group of representatives of the people, a Congress. And that's what makes it so very important and historic. The individual counts in our way of life. The individual is also responsible in our way of life. Now, those people who figure in that painting, what we call the Founding Fathers, those we call the Founding Fathers, were an exceptional group of Americans. They were an exceptional group of people by any standards at any time in history. But they were not gods. They were not demigods. They were not superhuman. As talented as many of them were, as brilliant as some of them were, none was without his flaws and failings and weaknesses. Some ardently disliked one another. Some were overly ambitious. They all, each and all, made mistakes. But that's the miracle. If they had been gods, they wouldn't deserve the credit, because gods can do whatever they want. What is so amazing, what is so to be so honored and respected is the fact that they, mere human beings, rose to the occasion to do what they did, when they did, without knowing how it was going to turn out. Now, we often talk about people living in the past. We think of history as about the past. If you stop to think about it a little bit, there's no such thing as the past, in the sense that nobody ever lived in the past. They lived in the present, just as we do. The difference is that it was their present, not ours. And it was a very different present from ours. And just as we don't know how things are going to turn out in our time, they had no idea then. The bravery of signing that Declaration of Independence is often lost on people. They were signing their own death warrants. They were declaring themselves traitors to the king, and if captured, they would be hanged. When they said they were pledging their lives, their fortunes, their sacred honor, that wasn't just rhetoric. That was the literal truth. And Jefferson makes the point about their imperfections in the very first line, when in the course of human events. This is about human events, human history. And as they were not perfect, what they did was not perfect, and they knew it. They knew that it would have to be improved upon. Now, in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, in the great day of the pioneering of the Bessemer steel process, there was a man named John Fritz, an engineer. He built the first machinery ever built in this country for making Bessemer steel. And he worked for months with his crew in the Cambrai Iron Works in Johnstown. And finally one day he came in and he said, "All right, boys, let's start her up and see why she doesn't work." Do you realize how American that is? It isn't perfect. We'll start it up and we'll see why it doesn't work, and we'll fix why it doesn't work, and then it will work. It's exactly the metaphor for the beginnings of the government, of the country. It wasn't perfect, but we'll fix it. And we're still fixing it. And we'll always keep fixing it, because it is a continuing experiment, and that's to our advantage. It isn't just handed to us. Washington Roebling from Saxonburg, Pennsylvania, took over building of the Brooklyn Bridge after the death of his father. He was 32 years old. There was so much about what his father had planned to do in that grandiose project that nobody had figured out how to make it work, but it was left to Washington Roebling to do that. He had to struggle to figure it out. He had to take what the father had designed and make it work, to his great suffering down in the caissons as a result of contracting the bends. The people who started the country we now see as the founding fathers in paintings with white hair or on the dollar bill or other currency. We see them in their powdered hair and their awkward teeth, and they look like founding fathers. But when they started the revolution in 1774, 75, and 76, they were young men. It was a young men's cause. Do not think of them as the old white-haired founding fathers. Jefferson was 33 when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. John Adams was 40 when he went off to Philadelphia. Washington, when he took command of the Continental Army at Cambridge in the summer of 1775, was 43 years old. Dr. Benjamin Rush, who's right up here in this painting from Philadelphia, one of the most remarkable men of that remarkable generation, signed the Declaration of Independence at the age of 30. It was a young man's cause, and they believed in it to the point of giving up virtually everything to make it work. When they were up against the most formidable military power on earth, when they had no army, they had no navy, they had no money. There wasn't a bank in the country. If you want to put yourself back into the 18th century, you have to make a huge reduction in scale. Everything was on a much smaller scale. There were only 2,500,000 people in all the colonies, 500,000 of whom were black men, women, and children held in slavery. There was one bridge between Boston and Philadelphia. So when somebody like John Adams or Samuel Adams traveled from Boston to Philadelphia, they crossed one bridge, which was a little bridge over the Harlem River connecting the island of Manhattan to the mainland. The largest building in the country, by far, was Nassau Hall at Princeton, which is a very fine building that still stands, but not very large. And the first Congress met not in Independence Hall, but Carpenter's Hall, little Carpenter's Hall. You could put two of them in this room. I feel it's the most eloquent building of them all because it's so small. It's so perfect. Perfect little Georgian building, exemplifying the ideals of the Georgian design of balance and light. And you walk into that little space and you think, this is where it all began, right here. Carpenter's Hall, built by the Carpenters Guild, still owned by the Carpenters Guild. And if you've never been there on your visits to Philadelphia, make a pilgrimage. Right to the left of Independence Hall as you're facing Independence Hall. We were small and untried, and we were promising something never promised before. The pursuit of happiness. Now, what did they mean about that? What was on their minds? What is that? What should that be telling us? Well, it did not mean longer vacations. And it didn't mean the piling up of more stuff. What it really meant, and they said this again and again, was the enlargement of the spirit and the mind. The life of the spirit, the life of the mind. In a word, education. All three of our first presidents said it. Washington said it. Jefferson said it. Adams said it. Washington was asked by a friend in Virginia to lend him some money so his son could go to Princeton. And Washington said, no, I'll give you the money. And he wrote a letter saying the boy's education at Princeton would not only promote his own happiness, but the future welfare of others. And then he wrote, knowledge in every country is in every country the sweetest, surest basis of public happiness. Jefferson said it in one sentence: any nation that expects to be ignorant and free expects what never was and never will be. Washington gave the largest personal contribution of his life and of that era to what became Washington and Lee College at Lexington, Virginia. $20,000, which over the time since has added up to a very great deal. Adams is perhaps the most vivid personification, emblematic example of the transforming miracle of education. Adams is often thought of as a rich Boston blue blood. He wasn't any of those. He wasn't rich, he wasn't a Bostonian, and he wasn't a blue blood. He was the son of a farmer, Braintree, Massachusetts. We know that his father could sign his name. That's all we know. His mother almost certainly was illiterate. But this very bright little boy got a scholarship to Harvard. Harvard then having 4 buildings and a faculty of 7. And he went off to Harvard, and as he said, I discovered books and I read forever. At 80 years old, he was embarking on a 16 French volume of French history in French, which he taught himself. He never stopped reading. He became the most widely and deeply read American of that very bookish time, because his life had been transformed by education. And he wrote, among the many of his outstanding contributions to our way of life, he wrote the oldest written constitution still in use in the world today. In the world today. The Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which is in most ways a rough sketch for our national Constitution, written 10 years before the national Constitution and written during the Revolutionary War, before we had become a country. It has a legislature. It calls for a legislature, an executive, and a judicial branch. It has a Declaration of Independence, which our original Constitution didn't have at first. But for the purposes of our discussion this evening, it also has a paragraph unlike anything that had ever been written before. And there could not be a more pertinent time to think about what it says. Wisdom and knowledge, as well as virtue, diffused generally among the body of the people, being necessary for the preservation of their rights and liberties. It's not going to work if you don't have wisdom, knowledge, and virtue. And as these depend on spreading the opportunities and advantages of education in various parts of the country and among the different orders of the people, in other words, everybody, it shall be the duty of the legislature and magistrates in all future periods of this Commonwealth to cherish the interests of literature and the sciences and all seminaries of them. And then he goes on to specify what he means by education. Extremely interesting. Second half of the paragraph. He says it means to encourage private societies and public institutions, rewards and immunities for the promotion of agriculture, arts, sciences, commerce, trades, manufactures, and natural history. Everything. It's all interesting. This, of course, is part of the spirit of the Enlightenment. It's all interesting. To countenance and inculcate the principles of humanity and general benevolence. Now, there's a great deal of talk, particularly in the last few months, about values, and should values be taught in school? And what are values? If you ask the question, should we teach values in the schools, and you say, what did the founders think? Well, here it is what they thought. But listen to what the values are. To countenance and inculcate the principles of humanity and general benevolence, public and private charity, industry, frugality, honesty, sincerity, good humor. It says in the Constitution of Massachusetts there will be good humor. And all social affections, and generous sentiments among the people. Not one word about religion, not one word about success, not one word about power. Benevolence, honesty, sincerity, generous sentiments. That's not money, that's generosity of spirit toward one another. Adams wrote a number of letters in which he tried to spell out what this was all about. We don't have to hypothesize about what he meant. We don't have to impose our ideas on him. He's telling us again and again. When he was in the Netherlands, he took two of his boys with him and enrolled them at the University at Leiden. They were still quite young, but they managed to carry the courses they had to take there. And Adams was particularly interested in the education of his oldest son, John Quincy, who he saw had an extraordinary mind. And he wanted him to have the right education early. So he said he absolutely had to read and learn to read Greek and Latin and read Cicero and Thucydides and the rest. But he said, don't forget the great literature of your own language. Don't forget the great English poets. And don't go places without carrying a book with you. Always take a book with you. He said, read somewhat in the English poets every day. You will find them elegant, entertaining, constructive companions through your whole life. In all the disquisitions you have heard there at the university, the lectures you've heard, concerning the happiness of life, has it ever been recommended to you to read poetry? Then he writes this wonderful, immortal line: you will never be alone with a poet in your pocket. Somebody said they don't make them like that anymore. Well, they don't make them like that anymore. At another point, he wrote a letter trying to explain to his family why he was doing what he was doing, far off in Europe, separated from them, not there to help raise the children, not there to help make ends meet, leaving Abigail to run the farm, raise the children, deal with all the difficulties of shortages and inflation that war brings. He had never failed. He never once failed to answer the call of his country to serve, often at great inconvenience, often at the threat of his life. And he said that he was doing it for the future. And he outlined what he meant to the family, private letter to the family. I must study politics and war, that my sons may have the liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture in order to give their children a right to study paintings, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. That's the upward climb he foresees. There is a beautiful moment in the life of John Adams, 20 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence at Philadelphia, where he went out under the stars after having listened to a particularly moving sermon in a little church in Worcester, Massachusetts. He was a school teacher at Worcester. He was about 19 years old, just out of Harvard. And Worcester at that time was the wilderness. I once made that remark in front of the Massachusetts legislature, and the fellow in the back said, "Still is." He was teaching school in this tiny little town, and he was in turmoil over what to do with his life. He'd gone to Harvard, it was thought, as it was for so many who went to Harvard in the 18th century, to become a minister. And he tried school teaching for a while, and he decided he did not want to become a minister, as his father hoped and expected. And he did not want to be a school teacher for the rest of his life, that he would enter public service, that he would get a degree in law, he would study law, and become a lawyer and a public servant. And the decision was hard because he didn't want to disappoint his father. But he made it, and he felt a great sense of relief. And that night, this was in July of 1756, he went out under the stars. It was a particularly clear, vivid night. And he was transported, as he said. Beholding the night sky, he writes, the amazing concave of heaven sprinkled and glittering with stars, I was thrown into a kind of transport. And he knew such wonders to be the gifts of God, expressions of God's love. But the greatest of all, he wrote, was the gift of the inquiring mind. But all the provisions, now this is a 20-year-old boy, man, standing out, probably in an open field, in Worcester, Massachusetts in 1756. But all the provisions that he, God, has made for the gratifications of our senses are much inferior to the provision, the wonderful provision that he has made for the gratification of our nobler powers of intelligence and reason. He has given us reason to find out the truth and the real design and the true end of our existence. It will be hard work, he wrote, becoming a lawyer. But the more difficult and dangerous the enterprise, the higher crown of laurel is bestowed on the conqueror. The point is now determined. I shall have the liberty to think for myself. Now, of all of the liberties we enjoy, the freedoms we enjoy, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, let us never, ever forget that great freedom to think for ourselves. And particularly now, when we are in a struggle, a very dangerous, very perilous struggle with a foe who believes in enforced ignorance. We don't believe in enforced ignorance. We never have, and we never will. And we have to understand that that has been our creed. That has been our prevailing theme since the beginning. Education, learning, the love of learning. And information isn't learning. As much as we are enamored with information, as inundated as we are with information, as privileged as we are to have all kinds of information at the touch of a finger instantaneously all the time. Information isn't learning. If information were learning, you could be educated by memorizing the World Almanac. If you memorize the World Almanac, you wouldn't be educated. It'd be weird. Learning comes down to books and teachers. Teachers of all kinds, not just the kind that are in the classroom. But let me say in passing that those who are in the classroom are doing the most important work of anybody in our society. And as troubled as the public education system is in much of the country, as inadequate as some programs are, and particularly the teaching of history, we have marvelous teachers who are doing a great job almost everywhere in the country, and we should be down on our knees in gratitude for it. Harry Truman said, "The only new thing in the world is the history you don't know." Wonderful line. Lord Bolingbroke, the late 17th, early 18th century English political philosopher, said that history is philosophy taught with specific examples. The late Daniel Borston, Librarian of Congress, once wrote, "Trying to plan for the future without a sense of history is like trying to plant cut flowers." Who are we? Where did we come from? How did we get to where we are? What did they who went before us do for us? All the institutions we have, our great universities, our school system, our library system, our public library system, maybe one of the greatest institutions of all, and never ever should we take it for granted. All you have to do is travel abroad and try to use libraries in other countries, and you come back home knowing there they are in every city, every town, public libraries. And if you ever get a little down about the nature or level of American culture these days, keep in mind that there are still more public libraries in the country than there are McDonald's. History teaches us tolerance. History teaches us patience. History gives us, I think, a sense of proportion. Right now, there's a great deal of anguish about the two Americas, as if this is something new. There aren't two Americas. There are probably 22 or 222 or 2,222 Americas. It's always been so. Arguments over church and state. Wasn't this called by William Penn a holy experiment? This has been part of what we are and what we're trying to work out since the very beginning, or the beginning of the beginning, if you will. Two Americas. Do they know anything about the Civil War? Do they know anything about the struggles that have gone on within towns between different groups, different factions, let alone nationwide? History is about people, and it's about what moves people. It's about that. It's about two of the greatest mysteries in life. One is time, and the other is personality. What is so fascinating, aside from the great currents of history, which do indeed flow powerfully at times, what is so interesting is how often major events turn on this curious quality called personality. How sometimes the squeak of a board on a step can change history. And how brave people who don't quit can make it different for the rest of us. I've just finished writing a book about the War for Independence, the Revolutionary War in the year 1776. One of the darkest times in the history of our country, in the whole story of our country, when Washington's army was pitifully down to about 3,000 soldiers. That was all. They'd been defeated again and again in New York, at Brooklyn, and then at Fort Washington, and then the long retreat across New Jersey, beset by disease and desertion. They weren't all heroes. Hundreds, thousands deserted from the army. What had been an army of 20,000 earlier that same summer was down to a mere 3,000. They were starving. They were in rags. And they got across the Delaware. And they regrouped, and they thought about the situation, and everybody realized that by all rational standards, the war was over and we had lost. But then, as sometimes you have to do when all hope's gone, the decision was made to attack, to cross the Delaware and strike at Trenton and Princeton. Don't ever forget that decision was made in Pennsylvania, and it was made by one man, George Washington. If you ever doubt the idea that one person can change history, there is a very vivid example. George Washington, through that whole summer, that whole year, was struggling to hold the army together because of the factions within it were tearing it apart. Then before we were even a country. Adams and others said this is the greatest danger we have to the country, because the Virginians dislike the Pennsylvanians, or the Pennsylvanians hate the Yankees from New England. Washington was a symbol of unity. He held the army together just as he held the country together as a symbol of unity through those first 8 years of his presidency. And let us never forget that the Revolutionary War was the longest war in our history except for the Civil War. Except for the Vietnam War, and the bloodiest war in our history except for the Civil War. It lasted 8.5 years. 2.5 million people altogether. 25,000 Americans died in the war, 1%. If it were that today, it would mean a loss of about 3 million Americans in a war. Imagine. And just because they wore clothes that seem strange to us, and they often come across as characters in a costume pageant, never forget their humanity, and never forget what we owed them. What a rich heritage this state of Pennsylvania, the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, can claim. Imagine. The Declaration of Independence was written here. The Constitution was written here. The decisive battle of the Civil War was fought here. The whole idea of an elective system in colleges began here when Benjamin Rush instituted that program at Dickinson College. The transformation of the country by the advent of inexpensive steel began here in Western Pennsylvania. And let us never forget the importance in the history of the state and of the country in that part of Pennsylvania known as Western Pennsylvania, my part of the state. Have you heard of a place called Meadowcroft? The oldest site of human habitation in all of North America, right here in Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, 17,000 years ago. Here. It's an old story. It's been going on a very long time. When I talk about Pittsburgh, I like to say that's where the first radio station was established, KDKA, the first public television station for educational television, WQED. The propeller for Lindbergh's plane was made in Pittsburgh. The boats that Lewis and Clark went up on their majestic, epic journey were all built there. If you were going to take a lens and put it down somewhere in the country to tell the story of the whole country, there's no clearer, more appropriate place than the state of Pennsylvania. Next year, the wonderful Heinz Pittsburgh History Center is going to be putting on a great exhibition. I urge you all to make the pilgrimage to see it, on the French and Indian War. The Heinz Pittsburgh History Center is now the largest history museum in the state with its new Smithsonian edition, and it's going to continue to be one of the major factors in the cultural life of this state, and it's doing wonders for education. We've got to bring our children to places like the Pittsburgh History Center and to the History Center here in Harrisburg and to all these sites. There's going to be a very ambitious and very important new Center for the History of the Revolution at Valley Forge, one of the major projects in the state. And it has grand support from Governor Rendell and others. And the new Constitution Center in Philadelphia. Tourism is the second largest industry in the state, as many of you know. And the number one reason people come to Pennsylvania is for its history. So let us, in our efforts to preserve the natural wealth, the natural attributes of this gorgeous state. Also, keep in mind that our history has to be preserved, and there is no limit to how much more new understanding can come from such projects, such as Meadowcroft. I met my first revisionist historian when I was 6. He was a mouse named Amos, and he lived in Benjamin Franklin's hat in a wonderful book called Ben and Me. Amos was born in Christ Church. He was one of 26 children of an impoverished mouse family. And I'm never in Christ Church that I don't wonder if some of his descendants are back there behind the paneling. Amos is an engaging mouse, and he starts by saying that Benjamin Franklin was no doubt a very worthy fellow and a great patriot, but if the truth were known, he wasn't all that bright. It was only because of me. And then he goes on and describes how he gave Ben all of his best ideas. I can't overestimate the value of a little book like that, which is still in print. If you know a youngster that you'd like to see get the bug of history, give it to him or her. Encourage good books. Encourage children to read good books. Encourage the use of good books in teaching history. Some of the textbooks, alas, that are inflicted on our children, it would seem as if they were designed to kill any interest one might have in history. We ought not to ask students to read things we wouldn't want to read ourselves. And we now know they love to read, want to read. Harry Potter disproved all the old conventional wisdom about that. We also know that we need to do a better job of educating our teachers. Too many teachers are graduating with degrees in education, knowing a great deal about the theories of education and the rest knowing very little about any one subject. And it's true in the sciences no less than in history. We have to rethink how we're educating those who do the work of education. One of my favorite thinkers and most effective thinkers in the whole field of education taught child psychology at the University of Pittsburgh, Margaret McFarland, the late Margaret McFarland, who said that what counts most of all in teaching is attitude. And she said, attitudes aren't taught, they're caught. The student, the class, gets the attitude of the teacher. And if the teacher isn't eager to teach the subject, the students catch that. It's that teacher that said to you in grade school, come over here and look in this microscope. You're really going to like this. Or who put a book in your hand and said, take this home over the weekend. I think you would enjoy this. What they were conveying was their love of the subject. Margaret McFarland said, show them what you love. We all love our country, and we should. It is a very great country. Not perfect, never has been, and that's part of our job, to keep making it better than it was. And that's part of education. That's essential in education. Young children can learn languages. We know that. Quickly, with amazing speed, at 4th, 5th, 6th grade. They soak it up and they've got it. They can learn anything at that age. That's where I believe the focus should be made. In grade school. They want to grow. That's the secret. It's not yet cool to be dumb. And they welcome the chance to stretch, to do more than they think they can. I know, I've worked with them. In the very last years of his life, John Adams had lost almost everything that mattered to him. And he bravely lived on, lived longer than any president in our history except for Ronald Reagan. He lost his wife, he lost his daughter, one son, many friends. He had no power or influence anymore. He lost his hair, he lost most of his teeth, but he never lost his inquiring mind. Never. It burned like a flame. And after his son, John Quincy, was elected President of the United States, all kinds of visitors came to call on him, which he hugely enjoyed. And one of them was a young, recent graduate from Harvard, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, if there was ever a scene that I would give a great deal to be present for, it would be that one. There were these two dyed-in-the-wool, quintessential New Englanders, two generations, very different generations, sitting down in a little room in a house that's still there, looks just exactly as it did then, talking. And at one point, Adams said, "I wish that there were more ambition in the country." Excuse me. And he paused and he said, "By that I mean the ambition of the laudable kind, ambition to excel." I think that ought to be, again, reinstated as our creed, to excel and to be grateful, to believe in equal justice before the law, to believe that we are gifted, privileged, and have more opportunity open to us than any people who ever lived at any time in all of history. And to live up to that privilege and to give back to the society, to the way of life, to the system of government from which we've all benefited so greatly from the time we were old enough to know anything. I thank you all for this tribute tonight. I thank you for the way you've listened to what I had to say. And I hope that you will never lose sight of the fact that we Americans, when we set our mind to it, truly can do almost anything we decide if we work together.